What's that?
Should give a warning, give people a chance to get back in the
I know. Can we bring the house lights up a little? Have a seat. Can we bring the house lights up a little now? House lights up a little. Up. Okay, good. There we go. I want to see you. So, there was a lot. I'm going to begin with some questions, and then we'll see where it goes. And you should be prepared to ask some good ones. I think you already are. My goodness, we have people already lined up. Okay, well, we'll get to them soon because I want to spend a lot more time than we normally do on your questions. But I get to ask the first few. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is that over history, there's been a real debate about whether it's clear that people have reason and they have passions. And is reason a slave to passion or passion slave to reason? And I think that the idea of deception suggests that in fact when we have deeply held beliefs, if our reason disagrees with that, then we deceive ourselves and we convince ourselves that reason is wrong. I'm wondering if you want to comment. It seems to me there are two that in some sense is one of the reasons religion persists so much, and B, I want to ask the question: does it mean that democracy? We're in the middle of a presidential election, and I think we see that reason is playing very little role, in my opinion. And does that mean democracy is a farce? So I wanted to see if you. If people would, yeah.
I met Noam Chomsky once in person, and it was for some discussion that was published in Seed magazine, and then they have some video of it. And I had a lot of respect for him in political analysis, and especially for seeing through the self-deceptions of our society. And a lot of people dislike him for being critical of the U.S., but I do think criticism ought to begin at home, you know. And in any case, when I met him, he made one comment that I thought was interesting, and he said in totalitarian societies, they just tell you how to act, and they don't have to do a hell of a lot of deception. He says in a more democratic society, they got to persuade you to do things counter to your self-interest. So he said, he claimed, and I must admit I was unable to find a good reference that backed him up, but he claimed that like something like 12% of the gross domestic product in the U.S. was in the persuasion industries, advertising, political campaigns, all these things that had to do with trying to manipulate your opinion. And anyway, I just thought that was an interesting point, that in a democracy you might have a lot more sort of BS coming at you all the time from the persuasion industries, whereas if it was more autocratic, they'd just say, mofo, you're going to act like that, and you ain't got a choice. I don't even have to persuade you, you know.
It's interesting because I think
democracy is the illusion of choice. Democracy is the illusion of choice.
Yeah, well, people in totalitarian countries, the ones I've talked to, it's rather interesting because they know what they're hearing is false.
Right.
And I should say, by the way, Noam's a friend, and he's actually, stay tuned because he'll be coming here next year. We'll be having a conversation with Noam Chomsky. So stay tuned. Anyone else want to comment on this reason versus passion issue?
I guess I'd like to, about the totalitarian regimes, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I think that there's still a lot of persuasion and that propaganda going on, and that when I was a young child, I was in a totalitarian regime that was in Franco in Spain, and I was young to figure out a lot of these things, but it was in the air, so to speak, and I think that you still have the same types of persuasion going on, but it's all one-sided. Perhaps in a democracy, the difference is that you have persuasion from many different sides coming at you, and that would make it more confusing, perhaps.
Well, I think that's a good point, and it reminds me of some of these old, like, Soviet jokes. They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. So it's not as if as you say, they're being lied to, but they're conscious that they're being lied to, you know. It's just, you know, there are rulers, they're saying what we should do, we don't agree with them, we have to acquiesce, but we're aware of it.
I grew up in a totalitarian times too, in a way, namely Los Angeles during the House Un-American Activities era, a gray and ghastly time when not just people in Hollywood were losing their jobs, but also teachers and scientists, anybody who dared to speak their mind, anybody who was remotely liberal lost their jobs. One child got her family in trouble because she said her father was a communist when actually he was an economist. Father was in big trouble for quite a while on that one. But what I would say about this is that there does seem to be a basic ideological divide worldwide, and probably behavioral geneticists tell us that some of this is genetically influenced too, which is the difference between extremely conservative people whose main goal is safety and protection and security and authority, and liberals that come with a cluster of being more open to experience and wanting change and so forth. And that in evolutionary terms, dare we say, both species are good for a society. You want people who are kind of cautious and want to keep things the same, and you want people who are risky and will change. But that said, what we're seeing now for our democracy is something else entirely. And it's one that has evolved as the moderates in the Republican side have abandoned the party, which is one of the things that is interesting about how attitudes change and how we persuade people. We're persuaded not by the opposition, because we can dismiss what they have to say. We're persuaded by people in our own community, in our own political framework, in our own religion, who can make a case for change. That's why the movement for gay marriage has to come from religious figures who have understood, who have made the case for that. David Myers, a wonderful psychologist and a conservative Christian, wrote a wonderful book, The Christian Case for Gay Marriage, far more persuasive than anything a non-Christian could say. And so what happens then is the dissonance, if you will, is minimized. I don't have to dismiss what you're saying because you're one of us. You're one of us. And so maybe I should listen.
And I think that your question and Carol's answers speaks to the changing role of the press becomes important here. And I speak now as a citizen, not as an expert, but that there was a time when the press attempted a role of objectivity, since we don't listen to the other side very well. As long as there's that ever-present signal that's sort of trying to be fair and make sure you hear a little bit of the other side, the press in that role plays a very powerful role. But today, the press has become specialized to the point that everybody tunes tightly into something that just supports their own point of view and doesn't get to hear anything.
That's a good point,
outside of that. And so in that respect, change becomes even less likely. People become more rigid and narrow in their position.
And I think the issue of the in-groups and out-groups that Carol was bringing up is very interesting, because to a large extent, I think that what we end up believing or choosing to believe is determined by who we identify with. And that, and it reminds me of an experiment with the choice blindness paradigm. In fact, lately, the same group of researchers, what they have done is they have gone out and done surveys in which they question people about their political and moral views, and people will fill the survey, and then they change the answers without them realizing. And again, they ask them to elaborate on why they feel about this political issue this way or that way. And what they find is that people who have very extreme views, those are not going to fall for it. But people who are not so extreme, but they're still polarized, but not so extreme, they can change their political positions on a number of controversial issues, and they don't realize, and then they will argue for the point that was opposite of their actual opinion. So we're much more malleable than we think we are.
Okay, given that, I have two more questions, then I want to move to the audience. maybe quickly, I don't know whether you want to go through everyone, but so given that we're susceptible to deception, including ourselves, and given we've heard of the techniques, how it happens, what techniques can we use, or what behavioral techniques, or are there behavioral techniques that we can use to try and protect ourselves against being deceived? I don't know who wants to jump in.
Well, I mean, I think basically the answer is no, and I think it's because deception is part and parcel to how it is that we interact with the world. Everything that we perceive to some extent is a decision that our brain has made for us, if you to put it in a in a loose sense, for us to perceive things a certain way. You see things the way you expect to see them is another way to kind of put it. So magicians are fooled by other magicians as long as their technique's perfect. They may know that there's 10 possible ways they could have done that trick, and they may know that there's only one way to do that trick. But if you see a really great magician like Juan Tamariz, who is widely regarded as one of the finest magicians in the world, he often does workshops with magicians where he uses decks of cards given him by the magicians in the audience, and completely flabbergasts everybody in the room. And they don't know how it is he did it, because he's just that good. And so it's not that they are so much better at magic that they're just not deceived anymore. And so I think the more important thing is to realize that that your perceptions are always imperfect, and to always take everything with a grain of salt. And that's when you can try and reason things through, and I think that that's a safer way to try and go about this than try and protect yourself from being deceived. That's just never going to happen.
Yeah, see, it's beneficial. It's beneficial to have passionate commitments to goals and ideas and beliefs. That's important. Those are motivating. Those keep us going. Those give our lives color and passion. But the goal should be to hold them lightly enough so that if evidence comes along showing that they're wrong, we can say, okay, give me a better alternative. That's the hard part, is finding that sweet spot between really holding a belief that's important, but being willing to let it go. I'm reminded of this. Gary Taubes wrote a book some years ago called Good Calories, Bad Calories. It's got a stupid piece of whole wheat bread and butter on it on the cover. And you think that is the stupidest cover. Whole wheat toast and butter, please. But as you read the book, what you realize is at the beginning, you're assuming the whole wheat toast is good and the butter is bad. And by the end of the book, you realize it's the whole wheat toast that's bad and the butter that's good. Talk about cognitive dissonance, okay? And so you think, whoa, this whole notion that eating fat is bad for you and makes you fat, could that be wrong? So as citizens, as health consumers, as political consumers, it's really important to be able to say, well, in spite of the fact that I've been on this low-fat diet for 27 years, maybe it's not the problem, you know? Sugar is bad.
There are three ways, perhaps, that I can kind of fill you in on that we're deceived in magic that may have some bearing in real life. And the first one comes from Conan Doyle quote that you all know from Sherlock Holmes. When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I find that to be true not just in watching magic that really mystifies me, but in life. I mean, even if it sounds ridiculous, when you sort of eliminate all other possibilities, whatever's left, even if it doesn't sound intuitive, tends to be the real method. And the second thing is, magicians are masters of misdirection. And the person he mentioned, Juan Tamariz, is considered one of the great masters in our art. And he's a master of misdirection. And that's a whole master class to talk about in and of itself. But there's a very basic tenet of misdirection that I see politicians use effectively, I see speakers use it effectively, and it's simply this. It's like Magic 101. When you want somebody to look at something, look at it yourself. And when you want somebody to look at you, look at them. And you see this in the debates, you'll see it again on Monday night, you'll see it everywhere. People that can control your flow, your eye contact. People that really know how to, like everybody in the audience is nodding because I'm nodding. I'm controlling that aspect right now. That's very effective. And then the last one is assumptions. And we bring assumptions to every situation that we step into. I assume this microphone is going to work because it worked an hour ago when I spoke. I assume the chair is going to hold me because it held me an hour ago. But you make all sorts of assumptions in magic that magicians play on. You assume this deck of cards works like the one in your grandma's drawer. You assume that when I shuffle cards, I shuffle them the same way you do, and you assume when I say I have 52 cards that I'm not lying. And all the time, these assumptions betray you. And the same thing in situations in life. There are times when we come to an equation that we're not seeing the entire part of it. And I think that's interesting, at least to me, in how it crosses over.
Jamy?
Lawrence, you mentioned my work in the skeptic movement, and the skeptic movement is about teaching critical thinking and the scientific method and the scientific worldview. And there's no magic bullet to protect any of us against deception, but basic fundamental critical thinking tools and how science works, those are the things that can protect people from gross deception. And I think we we often teach science wrong in this country because we teach kids to memorize the periodic table of the elements, which should come much later, especially if maybe you want to be a chemist, but instead of teaching the fundamental methods of science and the philosophy of science in undergraduate schools, we should be teaching that in first and second grade. And I think there's nothing better than that. It's why we don't really watch TV in my home, but my kids have an unlimited access to the Mythbusters on Netflix. Adam Savage is a good friend of mine, and I think it's the best science education. Just as when I was a kid, I watched Mr. Wizard, and just learning about how science works and how you test something and how you look and examine an idea. I think these are the best protections we have against deception, and we have real tools about that, and that's what the skeptic movement promotes.
It's interesting. I just came from a meeting in Geneva with theologians and scientists, and I said to them, that the difference between science and religion is that science, your faith is shakeable. It's eminently shakeable. In fact, it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be willing to throw it out. But while I'm happy to praise scientists, it's interesting, and you're probably aware of this. When you talk about this trust, deception is based on trust. As you know, scientists are trained to be skeptical, but they trust other scientists. Yes. And Randy did a wonderful experiment of there were experiments being done, I think at Princeton, on extrasensory perception. So he trained two of his assistants to trick the experimenters, and he said, when you go in and trick them, and if anyone asks you while they're doing the test, are you lying, are you tricking us, say yes. Okay? So the experiment was done, and the experiment was finished, and there were two subjects that demonstrated evidence for ESP, because no one had ever, the scientific enterprise didn't work if you assumed people were lying. And the scientists just trusted. And so it's interesting that in spite of the fact that we say we're skeptical, the enterprise, whenever a scientist lies overtly, eventually it comes out because the experiments demonstrate it. But it takes a while because the community isn't willing to believe that other people will lie.
Right.
And,
individual scientists are still humans subject to the same foibles, but it's the system of thinking. It's the scientific method that we hope outs that.
Well, I want to move the audience, but I will say, based on what I've heard, it seems to me that the guides that I come up with are the X-Files guides, which is we want to believe, trust no one, and the truth is out there.
There you go.
So let's go to the microphones, and we'll begin on the right-hand side. And I have to say that sometimes it's hard to understand the microphones from here, so we may have to repeat what you say.
My name is Christopher Deutsch, and I wouldn't consider myself to be religious per se, but I can find merit in religion, so I'm not going to debate the positives and negatives of religion, but the concern that I have in religion is when you get to the real extremes, when the deception comes at the point where we can convince people to remove self-preservation. So think of flying planes into buildings because it's the right thing and God told me to do it and I'm telling you to do it. What enables somebody to remove self-preservation in the process of deception, and how do we protect ourselves as a society?
Okay, did you all hear that?
No.
Okay, so the idea is basically, the question is basically, what enables the kind of self-deception that results in certain religious acts where you are willing to kill yourself, like fly yourself into buildings for a belief? So that you're willing to overcome your sense of self-preservation because you will deceive yourself into thinking something's going to happen.
I know only one fact relevant to what you're saying that I mentioned in my chapter on religion, and that's a sort of confused chapter. Religion is a very complex phenomenon. It's undoubtedly been selected in as religious sentiments. They're universal across cultures. Doesn't mean everyone believes it. But anyway, someone did a study of suicide bombers in 6 different cultures. And although we often associate suicide bombers with Palestine, Israel, so on, the actual much more heavily involved people originally were the Tamils against the Sinhalese or whatever in that part of the world.
Sri Lanka.
You know,
Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, right. And they murdered Gandhi off of a suicide bomber and so on. Anyway, never mind. They did it in 6 different cultures. And they were scoring people according to 2 different aspects of religiosity. And let me see if I can remember it correctly. But one is the degree to which you were socially religious. Did you attend a group, you know, a synagogue or a church or a mosque or whatever, and interact socially? Or were you more into contemplative prayer on your own behalf religion? Okay? That's poorly described. It's precisely described, I hope, in my book, or more or less precisely. In any case, there was a positive correlation between degree of religiosity in the social sense, how much you were committed to the mosque or to social interactions in your religion, and being a suicide bomber. There was no correlation if you took more of the contemplative, personal, prayerful, I'm trying to improve my phenotype through meditation kind of approach. Anyway.
May I add something to that?
Sure.
This is a wonderful example of the pyramid metaphor that I gave you before, because there have been, indeed, as Dr. Trivers says, many studies of suicide bombers. We tend, looking at them, to think that they went from 0 to 60 somehow overnight. The process of becoming a suicide bomber or belonging to any cult, the Jim Jones cult or Waco or any of a number of self-destructive cults in America where they've committed suicide for whatever reason, is not an overnight happening. It's step by step by step. No one says to a recruit at the beginning, join us and you will have to leave your family, you will never marry, you will never have children, you will give up work, you will leave your community, and eventually you will commit suicide for us. It never starts out that way with that bargain. It starts with joining the group and rewards for joining the group, and then the next step is a kind of love bath from everybody else in the group, and then we enhance your political goals and views. It's just, the point is only, it's step by step. And with each step is a greater commitment to the group, and for those who then, for social reasons, for the group, for attachment to the group, for the glory of the group, for the mothers and the family of these suicide bombers, consider them martyrs, to be admired. So again, I would say this is a normal social psychological phenomenon.
And of course, forgive me, but suicide bombing can be adaptive in the biological sense depending upon the return kin effects. You could do it skillfully. It's a dreadful thing, but it could cause return effects that were beneficial. Of course, it often doesn't. The terrorism merely induces extra terrorism back upon everybody, including your kin. Saddam Hussein, one of the charges against his inhumanitarianism was that he sent roughly $5,000 to $10,000 to the family of any suicide bomber in Palestine. So there's a direct reward there to the family through a third party from your action, which in principle, through inclusive fitness, survival of relatives to whom you're related, could pay for it.
And so, Robert, are you therefore drawing a potential thread between suicide bombing essentially and altruism. In the case of, a baboon will sacrifice itself to kill a predator, and we assume that's because of a protection to the group. That's a kind of non-human altruism, right?
Yeah, I hope I'm not walking into some kind of
No,
trap,
I'm not
but
saying
yes.
this. No.
Yes,
no,
I'm saying it.
Yeah, I know.
Well, one element that I
Don't
find
kill me.
interesting
No,
about
I'm not.
Susanna? Okay.
One element that I think that is interesting about suicide bombing, I mean, you have the whole issue of faith, but in a sense you can think of it as the ultimate example of delayed gratification.
Yes.
So in a sense, except for the religious issues aside, I think the qualities of a suicide bomber are some of the same qualities that make a good graduate student.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to remember that. Some of the students, I think,
Many of them
are
are
here.
good graduates.
Remember that. We'll go to the next question.
Hello,
Yes.
my name is Chet Shoup. I'm the author of the book Eden, Regaining Our Spiritual Freedom. And the question I have is, since states come and go and nature doesn't, could it be that the idea that the state is sovereign, mankind's greatest self-deception? And if so, why are we deceiving ourselves? And what is the consequences?
Okay, I didn't hear all of that myself. Did anyone?
I had trouble.
I heard, did anyone hear that? The question was, I heard, why are we deceiving ourselves? But I heard states come and go,
Well,
nature persists. Maybe you could step back from the
Step
microphone.
back from the
Okay,
microphone.
states come and go, and nature doesn't. Could it be the idea that the state is sovereign, mankind's greatest self-deception?
Oh, the idea that the
The
state is sovereign is a great self-deception.
And if so, why are we deceiving ourselves?
Okay, well,
And,
so
what's the
let me rephrase
consequences?
your question. The idea basically is if states aren't sovereign, why do we humans live in states? And I think there's a bunch of answers about that, evolutionary answers. They go back to political philosophy, but I don't know whether any of you want to address why do we submit ourselves. In another way, a famous man once put it: if we're born free but live forever in chains, why do we? Anyone want to touch that?
Well,
Okay, we don't have an answer to that question.
okay. let me
check back with me tomorrow.
excuse me just a moment. I have an answer, but I'm not going to give it here. But,
Good, because this is for questions.
But if the audience wants to know my answer, I have a website, spiritualfreedompress.com.
Okay.
And
Next.
Hi, my name is David. I have a question about an ancient solution for the problem of deception and self-deception was Plato's 2,500 years ago, where he said anybody who's really good at deceiving people should somehow be banned. And I don't think that would be obviously a good solution today, especially given like the kind of wonderful illusions we've seen up here. But I wanted to ask the panel, are there situations when experts like yourself do indeed feel competent to step up and say, believing something like this, even if it's legal, is harmful, and I have insight into self-deception, and you should stop doing it?
For fraud, for financial fraud. Financial fraud. So in our book, Sleights of Mind, Susana and I wrote we discuss necessarily some of the basic mechanisms underlying certain magic tricks, so similar to what Jamy did tonight. He described how a certain trick worked. And so, but what we did around all of those tricks is we had spoiler alerts. We explained that what you're about to read are secrets about magic, and once you know them, you can't unknow them, and certain aspects of these tricks may or may not, depending on the brain mechanisms involved, ruin the trick for you in the future. So don't read it if you don't want to know the secret. But there is a part of our book on fraud where it's very similar mechanisms and very similar actions by people, but it's used to con people out of their money, and we felt it was unethical to put the spoiler alerts. we wanted people to know what those mechanisms were, and we wanted them not to fall for it, even if it meant fraudsters went out of business. So yeah, sure, there are cases where, in the legal system, you should be applying this kind of idea and remove people from society when they use these types of methods to trick people out of their money when they're dying from cancer or whatever.
Is there this side?
Yes, we hear you.
No.
Hello?
Yeah,
Oh, cool. Thank
Yeah,
you.
we hear you.
One of the questions I have is about the nature of reality if we're easily deceived. There's a great thought experiment that Einstein did, and he said, what would I look like in a mirror if I was traveling at the speed of light? And one of the things I ask myself, if I'm trying to actually think of what reality would look like, at the speed of light, obviously it would be compressed, time would be different. If I was born into that reality and that's all I knew, would this reality not look, or appear to be real? Even at the quantum level, would it be different? So how do we find the actuality of what we're actually trying to perceive as reality,
Wow, that's
correctly?
Exactly.
Yeah. I must admit, I never expected a physics question in this audience. I'll give you a quick answer, and then I will move on. And the answer is, if you were moving at the speed of light, the entire history of the universe takes place in a single instant. So there is no reality. The whole history of the universe happens. There is no time. And so it's just not a good question.
Thank you.
I hope I can follow that up.
Okay.
My name is Chris Luna, and I'm a mechanical engineering student here at ASU. My question is, how much of the variability that we see in the IQ of individuals is real, and how much is an illusion?
Okay, variability in IQ. How much is real and how much is
An illusion.
How much is an illusion?
How much of what?
Of
the
the variability
variability
we see in IQ of people is real, intrinsic, and how much is illusory? You're a psychologist.
The variation in IQ?
Yeah.
How much is real and how much is illusory?
Yeah. Innate
maybe in
and-
the sense that how much is really there and how much is due to environmental factors of people. Perhaps people are suppressed.
It's 50-50. There it is.
We're giving great answers here. Do you want to give another one, Robert?
This is how much of variation in intelligence or IQ is genetic versus environmental?
Yeah, basically, I think that's how much is genetic and how much is environmental and how much is...
It's basically extremely difficult, if not impossible, to assign a quantitative value to that question. Every single genetic trait requires an environment to interact with to produce the phenotype. There's no such thing as genes floating around producing any effects on their own. They have to interact with the environment, at various levels. And likewise, if you're comparing people who differ genetically, then everyone has different environmental influences. So disentangling these effects and giving a precise quantitative value has been a long and I think completely fruitless or a mistaken goal of behavioral genetics. They used to take that seriously. They would compare identical twins versus fraternal or sororal twins, if you want, and try to calculate the degree of heritability of a trait off of that. But that's all within a very restricted group of genotypes and a restricted group of environments. So you cannot give a general figure.
And thanks to the work on epigenetics, we now understand that even identical twins are not identical. There are differences that occur in the womb between them. So it is like saying, is sugar or flour more a contribution to the taste of a cake? It's interconnected.
Thank you.
I think we're going to move on. Okay. Thank you, though.
Hi, hello. My name's Amy, and I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on neuroethics. You mentioned financial fraud, and magicians use deception in a way to entertain, whereas people who try to rob people, old people, of their money, use deception in a way that's negative. But you also talked about our ability to rationalize and our ability to get further and further down on that pyramid. And we do see politicians who accuse people of things that they do themselves. So where do we draw the line for policymakers? How do they decide when establishing the penal code where we punish others for doing that what we do? And is it all just an argument for term limits?
That sounded like a great question, but did any of you did you get it, Jamie?
Not,
you know, we have to do something about this sound
Sorry.
system
Really.
because
I'm so
it's very
sorry.
difficult for us.
So basically neuroethics, the idea that if we're
Step
all...
back.
Go on,
Step
keep going.
back.
I'm going to get closer.
Okay.
Go on.
Okay.
Neuroethics, if we... excuse me.
Go on, keep going.
Okay. If we all can rationalize our own actions, and if we all become more convinced of our actions with a greater perception of power, then what are your thoughts on neuroethics? If people can pass lie detector tests because they don't really think that they did anything wrong, how do we accurately establish a penal code that punishes people when they might not have even, where does intent, I guess, factor into all
so
this?
I think I get the idea. The idea is, in some sense, responsibility. If we're all deceiving ourselves and we can rationalize our actions, how can we have an ethics and sort of punish people if they don't really know, if really they're deceiving themselves in their actions enough and rationalizing them? How can we decide that they're responsible? So it's sort of responsibility as a result of deception. And maybe I think that's a good, maybe one more question after this.
Let me go back to, say, the 67, 68. So that was the Vietnam War, and as usual, people tend to give you the lie or forgive you if you're unconscious of your nonsense. They don't treat it as harshly. So they would say, for example, I can remember statements like this literally, Johnson or so-and-so genuinely believes that napalming Vietnamese children, that napalming Vietnamese children or is in the best interests of Vietnam. And I'm thinking, why are we giving such weight to whether they genuinely believe BS or whether they consciously are propagating it? I don't understand why self-deception is so often used as an excuse, you know. Oh, I wasn't conscious. Yeah. Well, with that response, I won't say any more.
Yes, end on the applause. It's always good.
Go out a winner, Robert.
Yeah, go out a winner.
Well, the legal system deals with action and not necessarily with intention. And the legal system doesn't answer the question in a philosophical sense or in an ethical sense, but it's an important distinction. And it's an important question. For example, there's all this discussion now about sociopaths and psychopaths, and if that's a genetic cause, now do you hold someone responsible for being a serial killer if they say, well, I had this condition? Well, eventually you have to hold people responsible, you know, regardless. And it's one thing. Your question means one thing in a social discourse, ethical and philosophical discourse. It means something entirely different, I think, in a legal setting, in which we have to hold people responsible for actions, regardless of what they believe or what they don't believe. I would also add, as to your comment, part of your question, that lie detectors don't work. They are pseudoscience, and they simply don't work, and they don't test lying.
Yeah.
Well,
Especially when
you know,
people believe
regarding
it.
your legal point, it's not fully accurate, at least the way I understood you saying it. When we look at murder, first-degree murder is defined as pre-planned murder with the intention to commit the murder. Second-degree murder can be, murder in the heat of passion or something like that. And you can go down to manslaughter, where it's unintentional, but the body is still a body at the result of it. So we do make certain distinctions that make some sense, you know, at
in degree of mitigation.
Yes, in that one.
Yeah.
I would add about this, I hope this is on target of your question. When I said at the end of my talk that you want to hold people accountable for the way they reduce dissonance and deceive themselves, I mean it in this sense. It is common in this country for district attorneys who could prove the innocence or guilt of a person who's been in prison, whom they put in prison, for 15, 20, or 30 years where DNA evidence might show that they were in fact innocent. So what you might think as reasonable people, isn't this a fabulous thing? Every district attorney, should be using DNA to confirm whether they were right, whether they put the right person away in prison. But instead, district attorneys have almost united in their resistance to the use of DNA and other scientific evidence that might show that they put an innocent guy in prison. Now, this seems like an unconscionable thing. Why wouldn't you want to know? But from their standpoint, they're saying, look, I put so much time and energy into showing that this guy was a son of a bitch and a rapist and a murderer, and now you're telling me that I, a decent guy, I'm the one with the white hat. I put the bad guy away. Now you're telling me he's not such a bad guy? The hell with you. And if he didn't commit that crime, he committed some others anyway. Okay? So what does this mean for citizens of America? It means we generally cannot rely on district attorneys to correct their own mistakes. That means we want to see that there are oversight places that will make sure that justice is done. This is what happened in Dallas when the new district attorney went in there and examined all the cases of that high number of black men who'd been falsely railroaded into prison. He opened up those cases and is reassessing them. He's not the one who put them there, but he's the one who can see that justice is done. It was Morgenthau in New York City who made sure that the guys who were in prison for the rape of the Central Park jogger all those years ago, they were completely innocent, and he got them out. The original police investigators who put them in prison to this day think they're guilty. Absolutely. So what this means for our system is we must insist on oversight places to make sure that mistakes of this magnitude are corrected.
And I don't disagree with the extreme crimes. I guess I'm more curious about the quote-unquote lesser crimes, that pyramid you talked about. The instances where we see with politicians, elected officials getting arrested for DUI when they've been cracking down, or domestic violence, beating up their spouses when they were passing these laws. How do we control for that slippery slope down that pyramid? And that's
it's a fascinating question, but I'm only going to give you one of them, and this is so because I do want to get to one more question. I will say, however, I will add one little thing, is that you were talking about lie detectors, which are garbage, but and we'll probably have a session at some point in the future. This is just the beginning. As you know, with functional MRI, there are people who are arguing they can tell the intent of people to commit crimes. And the legal system is only beginning to figure out how to deal with that. And I know, and it's going to become a bigger. It's
not a shred of evidence for that.
It's just the beginning, is what I'm saying. No, it's a real
Give
a real
boy
problem,
a hammer,
and you should worry about it.
Every brain will need scanning.
We'll take you, and hopefully you have the last and best question.
How much of self-deception is actually deception, and how much of it is us just covering for our faulty memories?
Okay, so how much
faulty memory?
Well, hold on. Let me just repeat it. Robert couldn't hear it, so let me just repeat it.
Yeah, I've only got one ear.
The question is, how much of our self-deception is deception? How much of it is just faulty memory? Now you could jump in, Carol.
I have to jump in because faulty memory is such a great way of reducing dissonance. One of my favorite studies was a study of Democrats and Republicans in their response to the information that Iraq did not, in fact, have weapons of mass destruction. As many people recall, this was George Bush's great notion. They had to have weapons of mass destruction. We know that they're there, so they weren't there. So years later, they go and they interview Republicans and Democrats who had supported the war and who had believed there were weapons of mass destruction. How do we reduce dissonance between what we believed then and what turned out to be true? And for Republicans, the answer was, for many of them, they're there. They're still there. We haven't found them yet, but they're under a rock. They're there, and we found them. Besides, we did find them, and that was why we went to war. Just a continued belief in weapons of mass destruction. The Democrats forgot that they had supported the war and believed in weapons of mass destruction. I never believed it for a second. I was never taken in. So faulty memory is actually a very good way of keeping our beliefs consonant with what happens.
And okay, we'll go Robert and then Susana.
Well, this is just one sentence. We have an image that our memory, we take a picture of reality as it takes place, and it probably decays over time, faulty memory. But what we know from a lot of work is that memory is continually reconstructed. So you can embed a new false fact into a memory. And this is one reason, for example, why it's a good idea, as it is in Netherlands, for example, to film all police interrogations, because through the process of interrogation, you can add a fact that's not in the person's memory, and 6 weeks later bring him back, and that's one of the most vivid facts in their memory. So faulty memory is not just a matter of the thing gradually decaying in a non-random way. It's much more apt to be a biased process, and it can be influenced by external factors.
Do you have any?
So I think that limited memory is only one way, one of the brain shortcomings. I was talking a little bit about this earlier. One of the many shortcomings that lead us to self-deception, because not only our memories are faulty, but we don't have conscious access to a lot of the brain operations that are underlying our ultimate actions and choices and how we interact with the world. And so what ends up happening is that we're acting, we're choosing, and we don't really know, but yet we have to make sense, and we have to make these actions and choices fit our life narrative and the idea that we have of ourselves as people. And so a lot of our self-deception makes things fit into a mold. Not necessarily, a lot of the times is to put ourselves in a good light, but not necessarily so, just to smooth the rough edges and make sense of reality. And one last thought that I have about this, and we were earlier talking about what behavioral techniques can we use against self-deception. And in this sense, it occurs to me that, and to my knowledge, this has never been addressed in an experimental regime or otherwise, but we see ourselves from a third-person perspective, but we do this unconsciously. We justify and explain our actions as we would that of a different person. But I think that because we have this tendency, we can take advantage of that and exacerbate it, and just to put ourselves consciously in a third-person situation. Like, okay, if this person, instead of being me, was somebody else, X, is that person acting with that and with the information that is arriving, is that person self-deceiving, or is it actually acting and choosing in a way that makes rational sense?
Okay, well, my memory isn't sufficiently faulty that I don't remember that we promised to get you out before now. And we have therefore deceived you. But before I close, I do want to thank, once again, this remarkable panel. It was wonderful. It was enjoyable for me. I also want to thank all of you for coming again to support the Origins events. And I want to let you know that, of course, speaking of self-deception, the next major great debate event is on the origins of climate change, and where we will explore many aspects of what's going on in the real world and the world of perceived climate change. That'll be in February. And then at the end of March, we're going to have another several-day event on science and storytelling. And in fact, later this week, I'm going to Los Angeles to film with Cameron Diaz for a movie that we're going to show here, the world premiere, related to our Origins project, in fact, at the end of March. So be prepared to come back and see that and support us. So I really want to thank you once again for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.